Well, just after talking about all that stuff about constitutional interpretation in the Supreme Court, it turns out that things have just been shaken up quite a bit in that arena. And, yeah, it seems pretty likely that Republicans will get another appointment, which potentially will make the Supreme Court a 6-3 conservative majority for the foreseeable future. Which kind of has a lot to do with what, well, with everything. And hell, maybe they'll overturn Roe v. Wade like they've been promising for so long. Although I mean, honestly, if they did, they would lose that from their toolkit to keep getting elected. Anyway, that's not what this lesson is about. So, let's get to the reading. So the reading for today is pages 237 to 242. And honestly, I think you should read the associated cases. But it's all about the First Amendment, freedom of expression, and enforcing morality. So that's kind of timely, I think. But there's a good question about, like, how much of morality should we even enforce? Can we even enforce morality? Like, should the law only be about, like, justice and order, or can we try to enforce morals on people? So, like, let's say that some of the things we talked about in the last lesson are things you don't think anybody should do ever. But, yeah, so, first off, we want to get out of the way the ideas of mala prohibita and mala in se. So stuff that's mala in se is stuff that's just bad in itself. That's stuff like murder is stuff that we pretty much all agree is like, yeah, that's kind of bad. And so we can prohibit that without too much of a moral question. Well, I guess there's still a question about whose morals are we going by? Just like any problem of any question of law and morals, who gets to decide? Like, who gets to say, yes, that's bad and that's good? Because I have very different ideas about this, but we've talked about that. Mala prohibita are things that are just, like, bad because they're prohibited. So this would be things like wearing a seatbelt, driving on the right side of the road, things that harm only yourself, like smoking cigarettes, or, yeah, it's just stuff we don't want people to do. But then we also have a question. If we're looking at, like, Kant's categorical imperative, that can give us one idea of morality. But at the same time, can we really say that not wearing a seatbelt only hurts you? Because, like, if you crash and die because you weren't wearing your seatbelt, well, that's a drain on public systems. You're hurting the people that care about you in your life. You are having an impact on society. Or smoking. Like, secondhand smoke is a fucking thing. So even if you're just doing it yourself, you might be harming other people with your secondhand smoke. Or the, like, property damage that smoking does. And if you've been in, like, a house of somebody who's smoked for 30 years, it's crazy. Everything's, like, brown and gross. Anyway, don't smoke inside. But so we have to ask ourselves a question, like, these things that are personal and private, are they actually hurting everybody? And if everybody does them, would that be bad? So, we've got a great case, the case of public nudity. Like, can we outlaw public nudity? Can we outlaw these nude beaches? So the case of South Florida free beaches is great for that. So go ahead and read that one. And actually that case comes out like, yeah, no, being naked is not protected free speech, so do it on your own time. But should it be? I mean, does it directly harm anyone for someone to be naked on the beach? And I mean, where does that logic stop? That it is bad, that it is, or rather that it's not protected speech? Because I mean, the reason for the First Amendment could be a couple of different things. It could be like to make sure that we're allowed to speak out against the government, like that was something that you weren't allowed to do to King George. You weren't allowed to talk bad about the king, so we want to make sure that we can talk bad about our government. But at the same time, there's also the stuff in there about, like, freedom of the press, freedom to assemble, freedom of religion. So should we not be protecting, like, any kind of expression? Like, is me being naked not an expression of, like, I like being naked? Does that count? What is expression? And, like, does money count? Does what you spend money on count? Our Supreme Court has recently decided that, yeah, money is speech. And so since big corporations count as a fictional legal person, then corporations can spend as much money as they want on political candidates. Which kind of makes things unfair when we're talking about our system that requires a lot of money to win. So it means that people who are supported by the rich are going to win more often. So who gets to speak up for the little guy? Should that money count as protected speech? We'll talk. That's a whole big thing. The book then goes into John Stuart Mill and the harm principle. So this is one way of deciding what's moral. John Stuart Mill's harm principle states that the only justification for limiting a person's freedom of thought and action is to prevent that person from harming others. His or her own good is never a sufficient reason for restricting a person's freedom, either physically or through use of the law. That sounds pretty good. So it's only to protect harm to others. Only to prevent harm to others is the only reason we can, like, restrict people's freedoms. So, how does that help? What might be some problems with that line of thinking? Yeah. Is there anything else I even want to add to that? Oh, on page 238, it starts talking about the ban on violent video games in 2005 in California. The targeted games were those in which the range of options available to a player includes killing, maiming, dismembering, or sexually assaulting an image of a human being in a way that appeals to a deviant or morbid interest of minors, and that is patently offensive to prevailing standards in the community. No, struck down. Why? If we can prove that, yeah, violent video games make kids violent and make them want to kill and rape more, if we could prove that, wouldn't it be in our interest to ban them? Now, I don't think you can prove it. I've played plenty of violent and sexual video games, and I haven't murdered or raped anybody yet. And I don't think I will. But, and I think there have been studies that show that, like, violent video games don't actually make any violence. So there's probably a good reason to strike down that law, just because it's stupid as all get out. But, could we consider violent video games legally obscene? How do we define obscenity? Ooh, we're going to get into that soon. Are they an imminent threat to public safety? Can we come up with some compelling interest in limiting access to these? Well, under Mill, if it's not harming others, then there's no reason to try to constrain it. Now, Devlin, on the other hand, asks us to think about society and what it means. Devlin says that a society is a community of ideas and ideals, an interconnected network of shared values and beliefs. So if we allow things that go against those shared values and beliefs, then society falls apart. That the very fabric of society could be damaged by not restricting things. So this is an interesting way of looking at things. This whole idea of, like, the social moral fabric. But then if we're going to outlaw things that go against this moral fabric of society, how do we know that the moral fabric of the shared values aren't just changing? That, like, maybe those things that we thought would go against it are now becoming more popular? How would we know that if people aren't allowed to do it in the first place? So there's definitely some problems here, especially with things like, racism, homophobia. What if society's shared values are just garbage in the first place? But it's not. It's not it's not just a trash way of looking at things. Because if we look at, do I want to get into that yet? Yeah, there's a section about, like, freedom of expression in the First Amendment. Performers like Eminem have come under attack for homophobic song lyrics containing slurs directed at gays. CeeLo Green has released albums laced with profanity and derogatory references to women. Oh my god. Oh, and it talks about Cannibal Corpse. All right, if you haven't listened to any Cannibal Corpse, you should. I can only assume they're talking about that CeeLo Green "Fuck You," which, oh no, am I being offensive? I just said the name of the song. Anyway, these are good questions. Questions about Eminem and CeeLo Green and Cannibal Corpse. But the thing I wanted to get to was at the end of this little section where it talks about hate speech. There's another case in here about the American Nazi Party in the Chicago suburb of Skokie. And they were having a white power rally, talking about Nazi ideas, flying Nazi slogans in a town that was nearly half Jewish. As many as 1,200 of those were actual survivors of Hitler's persecution of European Jews. Let's call that the Holocaust. And so they passed an ordinance prohibiting the dissemination of any material which promotes and incites hatred against persons by reasons of their race, national origin, or religion, or strives to incite violence, hatred, abuse, or hostility toward anyone based on race, religion, or ethnicity. Frank Collin, then head of the Nazi Party, challenged the ordinances in federal court and won. The court found that the ordinances impermissibly limited freedom of speech. The question of offensiveness as a justification for restricting liberty comes up in another example. But I've got a question here. Is that just offensive? Or is that a public harm? So there's a lot of talk flying around about how people just shouldn't be offended, or, oh, it's just a joke, or, oh, you liberal snowflake. Is it just offensive? Is it just like, I don't want people talking about, like, murdering Jews in my town? Or is that language, is that speech that has a direct link to public harm? Is this something that fucking, what's his name, Devlin, might kind of be right about? We are in the middle of a time where, God, social media allows us to access so much speech, and then, like, Google algorithms or Facebook algorithms or whatever make it very easy to get caught in an echo chamber where all we're hearing is ideas that we already agree with. And it has probably never been easier to radicalize people. So if we're radicalizing them to the idea that, women are lesser beings than men, or that black people are just violent by nature, or that Jews are just all greedy and are trying to run things from a shadow government. These are ideas that lead to people getting murdered. So, does that count as just being offensive? Or is this something that we do have an interest in restricting because it does impact the moral fabric of our society? So, go ahead and read those pages. Read the associated cases, and honestly, the associated, just all the stuff after that little intro. I require that you read that little intro, but, I would like you to dig into the rest of it for more of a look. I think I've got an assignment that I'm going to post about offensiveness and how we have to decide where to draw the line somehow. But yeah, beyond that, that's all for this lesson. We're already at 15 minutes anyway, so I guess we'll call it here. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see y'all later. Bye.